The first thing my mother-in-law said after my husband died was that she would take everything. Not, "How are you holding up?" "Megan." Not, "What can we do for you and the baby?" Just one cold sentence that changed everything. "I'll be taking the house." Brandon's accounts? The investments, everything he left behind. She said it calmly, almost casually, like she was announcing dinner plans. The room went silent. My daughter was sitting beside me on the couch, still clutching the small framed photo of her father from the funeral. She didn't understand what was happening. But I did. Brandon had been gone for less than 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the phone call that shattered my life. 3 weeks since the hospital corridor, the doctor's quiet voices, and the moment they told me the accident had been too severe. And now his mother was already dividing up his life like a shopping list. My lawyer leaned toward me and whispered that I had every legal right to fight, that I could stop this immediately. But I didn't say what he expected. I looked directly at Elizabeth and said the one sentence that made everyone in the room stare at me like I had lost my mind. Let them take everything. For a moment, no one spoke. Elizabeth blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. Monica, Brandon's younger sister, slowly leaned back in her chair with a look of surprise that quickly turned into satisfaction. They thought I had just surrendered. What they didn't know was that Brandon had left something behind that none of them had seen yet. And the moment their lawyer opened that envelope, everything would change. 3 weeks earlier, my life had been completely normal. Brandon and I had spent most of that morning arguing about paint colors for the kitchen cabinets. He insisted on a darker shade, something more modern. I told him the whole house would look like a furniture catalog. We laughed about it later while he was leaving for work. That was the last normal conversation we ever had. Brandon was 42 years old, a mechanical engineer who loved solving problems. Whether it was a broken appliance, a faulty car engine, or some complicated piece of machinery at work. He had this way of studying things quietly until the solution appeared. He treated life the same way. While I worked from home as a graphic designer, Brandon spent his days designing mechanical systems for an engineering firm outside the city. He wasn't flashy or dramatic, but everything he built, whether it was a project at work or our life together, was solid and dependable. He believed in planning. The accident happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. A truck lost control on the highway. Brandon's car was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The police said it was instant. But the word instant doesn't mean anything when you're standing in a hospital hallway waiting for a doctor to confirm that the person you built your life with is gone forever. The funeral passed in a blur. People came with flowers, casseroles, quiet condolences. They hugged me and said the same gentle sentences people always say when someone dies. Brandon was a good man. You were lucky to have him. You'll get through this. I nodded through all of it because that's what you're supposed to do. Elizabeth sat in the front row during the service, stiff and composed, her face expressionless. If she cried, I never saw it. Monica stayed beside her the entire time, whispering occasionally, checking her phone between conversations with distant relatives. At the time, I thought they were simply grieving in their own way. I didn't realize that they were already thinking about Brandon's estate. 2 weeks after the funeral, Elizabeth invited the family to her house for dinner. She said it would be good for everyone to talk and support each other. I should have known something was wrong the moment I arrived. Elizabeth had cleared the dining table completely. No food. No drinks. Just a neat stack of folders sitting in the center of the table. Monica was already seated beside her. Laptop open. Several printed documents spread out neatly. The moment I walked in, Monica closed the laptop and smiled politely. That was when I understood this wasn't a family dinner. It was a meeting. Elizabeth folded her hands on the table and looked at me with the calm confidence of someone who believed she was about to solve a problem. Megan, she began. Brandon worked very hard for everything he built. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said. She continued speaking like she was giving a presentation. The house, his investment accounts, the retirement funds, those things need to be managed carefully. They belong to the family he came from. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. But then Elizabeth leaned forward slightly and said the sentence that made the air in the room feel colder. I'll be taking responsibility for all of it. Monica slid one of the folders toward the center of the table. The house, Brandon's accounts, the investments. Elizabeth continued calmly. Everything he left behind. Then she added the part that made the meaning impossible to ignore. Everything except our granddaughter. Of course. Elizabeth smiled faintly, as if she had just made a generous compromise. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't grief talking. This had been planned. For a few seconds after Elizabeth finished speaking, no one in the room said anything. The silence felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened around the dining table. I looked at the folders Monica had placed in front of us. Each one was neatly labeled, organized with colored tabs and printed summaries. This wasn't something they had thrown together after Brandon's funeral. They had been preparing for this. Monica opened the top folder and turned it toward me like a banker presenting a financial report. As you know, she began, her voice calm and professional. Brandon accumulated a number of financial assets over the years. She spoke like we were discussing a business partnership, not my husband's life. The house alone has increased significantly in value. There are also investment accounts, retirement funds, and several long-term portfolios. Elizabeth nodded approvingly beside her. We simply want to make sure everything is managed properly. Monica continued. Financial decisions like this require experience. Her eyes lifted to meet mine. And with your design work and everything else going on, it may be overwhelming for you right now. The message behind her words was clear. You're not capable of handling this. Elizabeth leaned back slightly in her chair. Monica works in personal finance, she said, almost proudly. She understands these things much better. I sat there quietly, trying to process what I was hearing. Brandon had spent years building our life together. Every mortgage payment, every investment decision, every long night he spent reviewing spreadsheets at the kitchen table. It had all been part of the life we shared. And now his family was speaking as if I had simply wandered into it by accident. Brandon trusted us. Elizabeth continued. He knew we would protect what he built. I looked down at the documents again. Monica had already begun outlining the proposed arrangement. Elizabeth would take legal control of the house and major financial accounts. Monica would oversee the investment portfolios and retirement funds. They spoke about it as if the decision had already been made. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger yet. Something colder. You're saying, I said slowly, that Brandon's entire estate should belong to you. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. It belongs with the family, she said firmly. Monica slid another document forward. We've already spoken to a lawyer, she added. These arrangements can be formalized very quickly. The calmness in her voice made the situation feel even more surreal. They weren't asking. They were informing me. Elizabeth looked directly at me then. You'll still be taken care of. Megan, she said. You and the child will always be part of this family. But the way she said it made it sound less like a promise and more like a condition. I noticed that Monica had begun tapping lightly on her laptop again, pulling up additional numbers. The investment accounts alone could require careful management, she said. Markets fluctuate. These things require professional oversight. Elizabeth nodded again. We're simply trying to avoid unnecessary mistakes. Mistakes. That word echoed in my head, as if Brandon had spent 15 years building a life with someone incapable of understanding it. As if the house we shared, the accounts we opened together, the plans we made for the future, none of that had anything to do with me. I finally looked up at them both. Did Brandon ever say he wanted this? I asked. Elizabeth's expression didn't change. He didn't need to, she replied. Monica closed the laptop slowly. We all know what Brandon would have wanted, she added. The certainty in her voice was almost impressive. They had already convinced themselves. Elizabeth reached across the table and tapped one of the folders. The lawyer prepared preliminary paperwork, she said. Once everything is finalized, the transfer can happen smoothly. She paused, studying my face. I assume you don't want to drag this through the courts. The words hung in the air like a quiet threat. I knew exactly what she was implying. Legal battles take time, money, energy, and I was a widow raising a child alone. Elizabeth believed I wouldn't have the strength to fight. Monica must have noticed the hesitation on my face, because she softened her tone slightly. This doesn't have to be unpleasant, she said. If we all cooperate, it can be resolved quickly. Resolved. Like the life Brandon and I built together was just a financial dispute waiting to be settled. For a moment, I imagined Brandon sitting at this same table. I imagined him hearing his mother calmly announce that everything he worked for now belonged to her. Something about that thought didn't feel right. Brandon had always been careful, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who planned ahead. My mind drifted briefly to something he had said months earlier while reviewing some financial paperwork in the living room. Just in case, he had told me with a small smile. At the time, I assumed he meant ordinary estate planning. Now I wasn't so sure. Elizabeth interrupted my thoughts. So, she said, folding her hands together again, are we going to handle this like adults? The entire room seemed to lean toward me. Monica watched carefully. Elizabeth waited with quiet confidence. They both believed the same thing, that I would either break down or give in. And sitting there in that room, staring at the folders that mapped out how they planned to take my husband's life piece by piece, I realized something. They weren't just testing my patience. They were testing how far they could push before I fought back. And that was when I understood something even more important. They were already celebrating a victory that hadn't happened yet. I didn't answer Elizabeth right away. The three of us sat around the table, the folders still spread between us like pieces of a deal already signed. Monica watched me carefully, her fingers resting lightly on the laptop keyboard as if she were ready to pull up another document the moment I objected. Elizabeth, on the other hand, looked completely relaxed. She believed she had already won. Are you saying, I asked slowly, that Brandon's entire estate should belong to you and Monica? Elizabeth didn't hesitate. It belongs with the family, she said. The way she emphasized the word family made the meaning clear. In her mind, I wasn't truly part of it. Monica leaned forward slightly and slid another document across the table. These are preliminary transfer drafts, she explained. Nothing is finalized yet, but it shows the structure we're proposing. I didn't reach for the papers. Instead, I studied their faces. They weren't grieving. They weren't conflicted. They were organized, prepared. Elizabeth spoke again, this time with a softer tone that almost sounded sympathetic. Megan, I know this must be overwhelming for you. Losing Brandon so suddenly, raising a child alone. It's a lot. Her voice carried the careful patience people use when speaking to someone fragile. That's exactly why we want to handle this responsibly. Monica nodded. Financial management at this level requires experience. Investments. Taxes. Long-term strategies, it's complicated. She tapped the laptop screen. These accounts alone could require active monitoring. The implication was clear again. You wouldn't understand this. I felt a small wave of anger rise in my chest, but I kept my voice calm. Brandon and I manage these accounts together, I said. Monica offered a polite smile. Yes, but Brandon handled most of the financial strategy. Didn't he? Elizabeth leaned forward slightly. He trusted his family, she said. The words hung in the air. I realized then that neither of them was actually asking my opinion. They were simply waiting for me to accept their plan. For a moment, I imagined how Brandon would react if he were sitting here. He would probably listen quietly, ask a few questions, then calmly dismantle every assumption they were making. But Brandon wasn't here, and Elizabeth knew it. She reached across the table and placed her hand lightly on the folder again. The lawyer believes this can be resolved quickly if everyone cooperates. I knew what she meant. If I fought, this would turn into a legal war, and Elizabeth believed I didn't have the strength for that. I stood up slowly from the chair. For a moment, Monica looked surprised, as if she expected me to argue. But I didn't. I need to review this, I said quietly. Elizabeth frowned slightly. "There's nothing complicated about it," she replied. But I had already gathered the folder in front of me. "I'll speak with my lawyer," I added. The moment the word lawyer left my mouth, Monica's posture shifted. She closed the laptop slowly. "That's your choice," she said carefully. Elizabeth sighed. Clearly irritated. "This doesn't need to turn into a legal dispute," she said. "We're trying to keep this within the family." Within the family. The phrase echoed in my head again. I walked toward the door. Elizabeth called after me. "Megan." I stopped but didn't turn around. "If you drag this through court," she said calmly, "everyone will lose." There was no anger in her voice, just certainty. I left the house without responding. The drive home felt strangely quiet. For the first time since Brandon's death, my mind wasn't clouded by grief. It was focused. Elizabeth and Monica had come prepared. That meant I needed to understand exactly what they were trying to take. The next morning, I sat in the waiting room of my lawyer's office. His name was Daniel Carter, a calm, middle-aged attorney who had handled several legal matters for Brandon and me over the years. When I walked into his office and placed the folder on his desk, he immediately sensed something was wrong. "What's going on?" he asked. I explained everything. The meeting. Elizabeth's proposal. Monica's financial plan. Daniel read through the document slowly. As he reached the final page, his expression hardened. "This is aggressive," he said quietly. "Is it legal?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair. "Parts of it might be," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean you have to accept it." He slid the papers back toward me. "Megan, you're Brandon's legal spouse. You have strong rights to his estate." I stared at the documents again. "So I could stop this." "Absolutely," Daniel said. He folded his hands together. "If this goes to court, we can challenge every part of their claim." The room felt very still. For a moment I imagined Elizabeth's confident smile disappearing the moment a judge ruled against her. Daniel continued. "In fact, based on what I'm seeing here, you would probably win." I nodded slowly. But something about the situation still didn't feel complete. Brandon had always been cautious. Careful. Methodical. The kind of man who prepared for problems before they appeared. And as I sat there in Daniel's office, one quiet thought kept returning. What if Brandon had already seen this coming? Daniel didn't wait long before speaking again. "Megan," he said carefully, "you need to understand something. If Elizabeth and Monica are trying to take control of Brandon's estate this quickly, it means they believe they have an advantage." I sat across from his desk, staring at the folder he had just pushed back toward me. "Do they?" I asked. Daniel shook his head slowly. "Not necessarily, but people usually only move this aggressively when they think the other side won't fight." He leaned forward slightly. "You have strong legal rights here. As Brandon's spouse, you are the primary heir to most of his estate, unless specific legal documents say otherwise." The words should have reassured me. Instead, they made something else surface in my mind. Specific legal documents. Brandon had always been organized when it came to finances. He kept copies of everything: insurance papers, mortgage statements, investment reports. Sometimes he would spend hours reviewing spreadsheets late at night. And every once in a while he would say something that sounded casual but now felt different in hindsight. Just in case. He had told me once. At the time I had laughed and told him he was overthinking things. Now I wasn't so sure. Daniel watched me quietly. "What are you thinking?" he asked. I hesitated. "Brandon handled most of the long-term planning," I said. "Investments, retirement accounts, things like that." Daniel nodded. "That's common in many families. But Brandon didn't like leaving things unfinished." I continued slowly. He was always preparing for the next problem before it appeared. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "That's actually a good thing when it comes to estate planning." I looked down at my hands. What if he already anticipated something like this? Daniel didn't answer immediately. "If Brandon created additional legal protections," he said carefully, "they would normally appear in estate documentation. But not always, he added after a moment. The room grew quiet. What do you mean? I asked. Some asset structures are created separately from the main estate files, he explained. Trusts, asset protections, private agreements. Sometimes people do that to keep things organized or confidential. I felt a small chill run through me. If Brandon created something like that, I said, would Elizabeth know? Daniel shook his head. Not unless it was disclosed. For the first time since the meeting at Elizabeth's house, something inside me shifted. Elizabeth and Monica had walked into that conversation with complete confidence. They believed they had already accounted for everything. But what if they hadn't? Daniel noticed the change in my expression. What are you thinking about? He asked again. I hesitated before answering. Brandon had a workshop in the garage, I said. Daniel looked confused. A workshop? He kept a locked cabinet there, I continued. Mostly tools and documents. Things he didn't want scattered around the house. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You think there might be something there? I don't know, I admitted. But Brandon wasn't careless. Daniel nodded slowly. It's worth checking. Later that evening, I stood in the garage alone. The workshop smelled faintly of motor oil and wood dust. Brandon had always liked fixing things in here. The workbench was still covered with tools exactly where he had left them. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the empty space where he used to work. It felt strange being here without him. I walked over to the metal cabinet against the wall. Brandon kept it locked most of the time. I opened the drawer where he usually kept spare keys and found the small ring he had labeled garage storage. My hands felt slightly unsteady as I unlocked the cabinet. Inside were several neatly arranged folders, a small safe box, and a stack of labeled envelopes. Everything was exactly the way Brandon would have organized it. I started going through the folders one by one. Insurance documents, property records, investment summaries. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed a thick envelope tucked beneath one of the folders. It had my name written across the front. Not typed. Handwritten, Megan. My heart began to beat faster. I picked up the envelope and turned it over. The seal had never been opened. For a moment, I just stared at it. Brandon's handwriting was unmistakable. Under my name was a second line. Only open if necessary. I sat down slowly on the stool beside the workbench. The garage felt very quiet. I ran my fingers lightly over the edge of the envelope but didn't break the seal. Brandon had always been deliberate when he wrote instructions like this. If he had left something behind, it meant he expected a moment when I might need it. I thought about Elizabeth's confident voice at the dinner table, about Monica's carefully prepared documents, about the way they spoke as if Brandon's entire life already belonged to them. And suddenly the envelope in my hands felt heavier than before. Not physically, but in what it might contain. I placed it carefully back on the workbench and looked around the workshop again. Brandon had built so many things here. Furniture, shelves, even the small wooden toy chest our daughter kept in her bedroom. He never rushed projects. He planned them, measured twice, prepared for every possible mistake before cutting the first piece of wood. As I stared at the envelope again, one thought became impossible to ignore. Brandon had known something might happen, and whatever he had prepared was now sitting in front of me, still sealed. I sat in Brandon's workshop for a long time before opening the envelope. The garage was quiet except for the faint ticking of the cooling engine from my car outside. The workbench lamp cast a warm circle of light across the table, illuminating the envelope that had my name written across the front. Megan. Brandon's handwriting was steady, confident, the same way it always looked when he labeled tools or wrote notes on our grocery lists. Only open if necessary. I turned the envelope over again in my hands. For a moment, I almost left it sealed. Part of me was afraid of what it might contain. But another part of me, the part that had listened to Elizabeth calmly divide up Brandon's life 2 weeks after his funeral, knew that the moment Brandon had prepared for might already be here. I broke the seal. Inside were several folded documents and a single handwritten letter. I opened the letter first. Megan, if you're reading this, something has probably gone wrong. I'm hoping that never happens. But you know me, I like preparing for problems before they show up. The words made me smile faintly despite everything. That was exactly how Brandon thought. He continued writing in the same calm tone I could almost hear in my head. Over the past year, I've been reorganizing some of our financial structure. Most of our assets are now protected under a legal framework that prevents them from being transferred or controlled without the conditions listed in the documents attached here. You don't need to worry about the details right now. Daniel Carter already has the primary files. But I wanted you to have this envelope in case anyone tries to take control of the estate after I'm gone. My chest tightened slightly when I read that line. Brandon had actually imagined this scenario. If there is ever pressure from outside the household, family included, do not panic. Just let them believe they're in control until the right moment. The plan will protect you and our daughter. And Megan, if this envelope ever becomes necessary, it means I'm not there to explain things anymore. But I trust you to know when the right moment is. Love always. Brandon. For a long time I sat there staring at the letter. The grief that had followed me since the accident was still there. But now it was mixed with something else. Understanding. Brandon hadn't just left behind memories. He had left a strategy. I carefully unfolded the documents that had been tucked behind the letter. They were dense legal pages filled with structured language, official signatures, and references to something called a protected asset trust. I didn't understand all of it. But one thing was immediately clear. These weren't ordinary estate papers. The trust structure described how the majority of Brandon's financial assets, including investments and long-term accounts, had been transferred into a protected arrangement months earlier. Certain conditions controlled who could access or manage those assets. I read the section twice to make sure I understood the most important line. Any attempt to transfer ownership of those assets outside the trust structure would be legally invalid. My mind drifted back to Elizabeth sitting confidently at the dining table. I'll be taking responsibility for everything. Monica explaining how the investments would be managed. They had believed the estate was a simple transfer. But Brandon had quietly changed the rules long before the accident. I gathered the papers and drove straight back to Daniel's office the next morning. When I placed the envelope on his desk and explained where I found it, his expression shifted immediately.
"Where did you get this?"
he asked. Brandon left it in his workshop, I said. Daniel opened the envelope and began reviewing the documents carefully. The more he read, the quieter he became. After several minutes, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. "Well," he said slowly, "this changes things." I waited. These documents confirm that Brandon placed the majority of his assets into a legally protected trust months before the accident. Daniel explained. "So Elizabeth can't take them?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not in the way she's planning." He tapped one of the pages with his finger. "If these documents are valid, and they appear to be, then the transfer arrangement Elizabeth proposed only applies to a small portion of Brandon's estate." I felt the tension in my shoulders loosen slightly. "But there's something else," Daniel continued. He lifted the letter Brandon had written. "He told you to wait for the right moment." I nodded. Daniel folded the papers neatly and slid them back into the envelope. "If you reveal these documents now," he said, "Elizabeth will immediately realize she miscalculated. But if you wait?" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Elizabeth and Monica believed they were winning. They were preparing legal paperwork, planning how to divide assets they thought would soon belong to them. Daniel studied me carefully. "The question is," he said, "how you want to play this." I looked down at Brandon's letter again. Just let them believe they're in control until the right moment. For the first time since the accident, the situation felt strangely clear. Elizabeth expected me to fight, to panic, to challenge her claims immediately. But Brandon had already predicted that reaction. He had built the plan around something else. Patience. I closed the envelope slowly. "I won't fight them," I said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You're going to let them think they've won?" I nodded. Yes. Because Brandon hadn't just protected the estate. He had designed the perfect moment for the truth to appear. And that moment wasn't today. It was still coming. When I told Daniel that I wasn't going to fight Elizabeth, he stared at me for a long moment. "You're serious?" he asked. I nodded and rested the envelope carefully on his desk. "Yes." Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "Most clients walk into my office ready for war in situations like this," he said. "You're doing the opposite." I looked down at Brandon's letter again. "Brandon expected this," I said quietly. Daniel followed my gaze to the envelope. "He clearly planned for something," he admitted. "But letting Elizabeth move forward with her claim could create complications." "Not if the trust is valid," I replied. Daniel exhaled slowly. "That trust structure is very solid on paper. But if Elizabeth's lawyer pushes aggressively, this could still turn into a long legal fight." I thought about Elizabeth's confident expression during the meeting at her house. She believed I was weak, grieving, unprepared. "Then we let her push," I said. Daniel studied me carefully. "You want them to reveal their entire strategy first." I nodded. "They already think I've lost." Daniel tapped his fingers lightly against the desk. "There is some logic to that approach," he admitted. "If they move forward assuming they've won, they may expose their entire plan before realizing the trust blocks them." He opened a folder and began making notes. "But you need to be very careful," he added. "You can't reveal that you know about the trust." "I won't." Daniel looked up again. "You'll need to continue cooperating with them." "That won't be difficult," I said, "because Elizabeth already believed she was in control." Daniel finally nodded. "All right," he said. "But when the time comes, you bring those documents to me immediately." I placed the envelope back into my bag. "Understood." When I left his office, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Brandon's accident. Clarity. For weeks, everything had felt chaotic. Now there was a plan. 2 days later, Elizabeth called. Her voice sounded calm and confident, the same tone she used during the meeting at her house. "Megan," she said, "have you had time to review the paperwork?" I paused briefly before answering. "Yes." "And?" Her tone suggested she already knew the answer she expected. "I won't fight it," I said. There was a short silence on the line. Then Elizabeth laughed softly. "I think that's the wisest decision you could make." Monica's voice appeared faintly in the background, asking something I couldn't hear. Elizabeth lowered her voice slightly. "We'll begin finalizing the transfer documents this week." "That's fine," I said. Another pause. "You're handling this very maturely," Elizabeth added. I almost smiled at the word. Maturely. As if surrendering everything my husband built was a sign of emotional stability. "When do you want to meet?" I asked. Elizabeth sounded pleased. "Our lawyer will schedule the final paperwork meeting soon. Probably in a few weeks. Just let me know," I said. After I hung up, I placed the phone down slowly. The conversation had gone exactly the way Brandon predicted. Elizabeth didn't question my decision. She didn't suspect anything. To her, this was simply confirmation that her plan was working. Over the next week, the messages from Elizabeth and Monica became more frequent. They sent updated drafts of the estate transfer paperwork. Monica included financial summaries and asset lists as if she were already managing the accounts. I read every document carefully but never argued. Whenever Elizabeth asked if I had questions, I gave the same answer. No. The more cooperative I appeared, the more confident they became. One evening I received an email from Monica containing a detailed breakdown of Brandon's investments. She had already begun planning how to reorganize several of the accounts. "Some of these portfolios could be rebalanced once the transfer is complete," she wrote. Rebalanced. The word felt strangely ironic, because the accounts she was discussing were already protected inside Brandon's trust. She just didn't know it yet. Later that night, I sat in the living room reviewing the documents again. Brandon's letter rested beside me on the table. Just let them believe they're in control until the right moment. I had followed his instructions exactly. And every day Elizabeth and Monica moved further into the illusion they had created. 2 weeks later, Elizabeth called again. "We have a date," she said. "For what?" I asked. The final signing meeting, she replied. Her voice carried unmistakable satisfaction. Our lawyer has scheduled the transfer appointment. My grip tightened slightly on the phone. When? Next Thursday, Elizabeth said. At the firm's office. I could almost picture her sitting comfortably at her desk, already imagining the moment everything would officially become hers.
I'll be there,
I said.
Good,
she replied. Then she added something that made the corner of my mouth tighten slightly. I think Brandon would be proud of how cooperative you've been. For a moment, I didn't respond. Not because I was offended, but because I was imagining Brandon's reaction to that sentence. He probably would have smiled quietly, just the way he did when he solved a problem no one else saw coming. After the call ended, I walked into the garage and stood in the doorway of his workshop. The envelope with the trust document sat safely inside my bag. Next Thursday. That would be the moment Elizabeth believed she had won everything. And it would also be the moment Brandon's plan finally revealed itself. About a week before the final signing meeting, Elizabeth stopped pretending. The careful tone she had used during our earlier conversations slowly disappeared. The polite patience was gone, replaced by the calm confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been secured. When she called now, she didn't ask questions. She gave updates. Our lawyer is preparing the final documents, she said one afternoon. Once everything is signed, the transfer process should move quickly. I simply responded, okay. Elizabeth seemed pleased by how little resistance she encountered. In fact, the less I spoke, the more comfortable she became. Monica's messages grew more frequent as well. She began sending spreadsheets and financial summaries, occasionally adding small comments about future plans. Once the transfer is complete, I'll need to review the investment portfolio structure, she wrote in one email. Another message arrived 2 days later. The house may need some renovations if we decide to increase resale value. Resale value? I read the message twice. Brandon had spent years designing and improving that house. He built the kitchen island himself. He installed the hardwood flooring one winter weekend after watching tutorials online. And Monica was already calculating how quickly it could be sold. I closed the email without responding. A few days later, Elizabeth hosted another small family gathering. This time, the invitation was casual. Just dinner, she said. But the atmosphere felt different the moment I walked into the house. Elizabeth moved through the room with the relaxed authority of someone celebrating a quiet victory. Several relatives were already there, standing around the living room with drinks in their hands. Conversations stopped briefly when I entered. Not out of hostility, but curiosity. Elizabeth approached me with a warm smile. Megan, she said, giving me a light hug. I'm glad you came. Her tone sounded almost friendly now. Thank you for being so reasonable through all of this. Reasonable. That word again. I nodded politely. Monica joined us a moment later, holding a glass of wine. We've been explaining the situation to everyone, she said casually. She gestured toward the relatives in the room. They all understand how complicated estates can become, Elizabeth added smoothly. But thankfully, we've been able to keep things organized. I noticed several relatives nodding quietly. Some even offered small smiles of approval. They believed Elizabeth's version of the story, that she had stepped in to responsibly manage Brandon's estate while I stepped aside. I realized something important in that moment. Elizabeth hadn't just prepared legal documents. She had also prepared the narrative. To the rest of the family, she wasn't taking Brandon's assets. She was protecting them. One of Brandon's distant cousins approached me with a sympathetic expression. I heard you decided not to fight over the estate, he said quietly. I simply nodded. That's probably for the best, he added. Across the room, Elizabeth watched the conversation with quiet satisfaction. The story had already spread. In their version of events, I was the grieving widow who realized she couldn't handle the financial responsibilities Brandon left behind. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was the responsible matriarch stepping in to manage things properly. Monica was the financial expert guiding the process. It was a perfect narrative, and they believed it completely. Later that evening, I found myself standing alone near the window while Monica spoke with two relatives nearby. I overheard part of the conversation. Once the transfer is finalized, we'll need to restructure some of the investments. Monica was saying, Brandon had a decent portfolio, but it could be optimized much better. One of the relatives asked about the house. Monica shrugged casually. We'll probably evaluate whether to keep it or sell. Sell. The word landed quietly in my mind. Elizabeth joined the conversation a moment later. We'll make the responsible decision, she said. Then she glanced across the room at me. Her eyes carried a look that was almost gentle. But underneath it was certainty. She believed I had already surrendered. When the gathering ended, Elizabeth walked me to the door. I know this situation hasn't been easy, she said. But you handled it well. I watched her carefully. For Brandon's sake, she continued. It's important that his legacy is managed properly. I nodded once. I agree. Elizabeth seemed satisfied. The signing meeting is next week, she reminded me. I'll be there, I said. She smiled warmly. Good. Outside, the night air felt cooler than I expected. I walked slowly to my car, thinking about everything I had just seen. Elizabeth wasn't hiding her intentions anymore. Monica had already begun planning the future. To them, Brandon's estate had already changed hands. They were simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. As I drove home, I realized something else. The more confident Elizabeth and Monica became, the less careful they were. They spoke openly, planned openly, celebrated openly. Greed had made them careless. By the time I reached my driveway, the house was dark and quiet. I stepped inside and placed my bag on the kitchen counter. The envelope Brandon left behind rested safely inside. I removed it slowly and placed it on the table. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Elizabeth and Monica believed the final meeting next week would confirm their victory. They believed the estate would officially become theirs. But the envelope on the table held a very different ending to that story. And when Elizabeth's lawyer opened it, the version of the future they had already begun celebrating would disappear instantly. The morning of the signing meeting arrived faster than I expected. I woke up before sunrise, long before my daughter's alarm clock usually went off. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that exists only in the early hours before the rest of the world begins moving. For a moment, I simply sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring out the window. 3 months ago, Brandon had been sitting in this same chair arguing with me about cabinet colors. Now I was preparing to attend a meeting where his entire estate would supposedly be transferred to his mother. Life had a strange way of collapsing time. I finished the coffee slowly and went upstairs to get ready. I chose simple clothes, nothing dramatic. Nothing that would suggest I was preparing for a confrontation. Just another legal appointment. Before leaving the house, I opened my bag and checked the envelope one more time. Brandon's handwriting stared back at me. Megan, only open if necessary. I slid the envelope back inside the bag and closed it carefully. Today would be the moment Brandon had been preparing for. Elizabeth's lawyer's office was located downtown in a tall glass building surrounded by several other law firms and financial offices. When I stepped into the conference room, Elizabeth and Monica were already there. Elizabeth sat at the head of the table with the relaxed posture of someone attending a celebration rather than a legal negotiation. Monica sat beside her with her laptop open and several printed folders arranged neatly in front of her. Their lawyer stood near the window reviewing documents. Elizabeth looked up when I entered. Megan, she said warmly. The tone in her voice almost sounded welcoming. I'm glad you're here. I nodded and took a seat across the table. Monica offered a polite smile. Everything should move quickly today, she said. Most of the paperwork is already prepared. Elizabeth's lawyer stepped forward and began organizing the documents into neat stacks. Thank you all for coming, he said. His voice carried the calm professionalism of someone who handled estate transfers regularly. We'll simply review the transfer documents and finalize the signatures. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair. Let's proceed, she said confidently. I noticed the faint smile on her face. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The lawyer began explaining the paperwork in careful, formal language. Each document described a portion of Brandon's estate, the house, certain financial accounts, and administrative authority for the assets Elizabeth believed she would soon control. Monica occasionally interrupted to clarify small financial details. Yes, that account should fall under the primary management structure, she said at one point. Her tone carried the quiet confidence of someone already planning how the assets would be handled. Elizabeth listened patiently, occasionally nodding. To them, this was not a negotiation. It was a confirmation. After several minutes, the lawyer placed a stack of papers in front of me. These are the final transfer acknowledgments, he explained. If you're comfortable with the arrangement, we can proceed with the signatures. The room grew very quiet. Elizabeth watched me carefully. Monica leaned forward slightly, her fingers resting near the keyboard of her laptop. They both expected hesitation, or perhaps one last argument. Instead, I picked up the pen. I didn't ask questions. I didn't challenge the documents. I simply signed where the lawyer indicated, page after page. Elizabeth's shoulders relaxed slightly as the signatures continued. Monica exchanged a quick glance with her. The tension that had existed during earlier meetings seemed to disappear. They believed the conflict was finally over. When I finished signing the final page, I placed the pen down calmly. Elizabeth exhaled softly. Well, she said with a small smile. That was simpler than expected. Monica closed her laptop. Yes, she agreed. Much easier than dragging things through court. The lawyer began gathering the signed papers together. From Elizabeth's perspective, the transfer process had officially begun. The victory she had been planning for weeks was now sitting in a neat stack of legal documents on the table. I reached into my bag. The room was quiet again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. Elizabeth and Monica were both relaxed now, already speaking quietly with their lawyer about the next administrative steps. I placed the sealed envelope on the conference table. The sound of the paper sliding across the surface made all three of them look up. Elizabeth frowned slightly. What's that? She asked. I rested my hands calmly on the table. Something Brandon left, I said. Monica glanced at the envelope. Left where? She asked. In his workshop. Elizabeth studied the envelope carefully. Her expression suggested mild curiosity, but not concern. After all, the paperwork had already been signed. She turned toward her lawyer. You can go ahead and open it, she said. The lawyer reached forward and picked up the envelope. He broke the seal and removed the documents inside. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair again, her faint smile returning. Monica looked briefly at me before turning her attention back to the lawyer. He began reading the first page silently. At first, his expression remained neutral. Then his eyes moved back to the top of the page. He read the same paragraph again, this time more slowly. The room grew noticeably quieter. Elizabeth noticed the pause. What does it say? She asked. The lawyer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the second page. As he continued reading, the calm expression on his face began to fade. And for the first time since the meeting began, Elizabeth's confident smile started to disappear. Elizabeth's lawyer didn't speak for several seconds. He continued reading the documents in silence, his eyes moving slowly across the pages Brandon had placed inside the envelope. The confident rhythm that had filled the meeting earlier was gone. The room felt different now. Elizabeth leaned forward slightly. Well, she asked. The lawyer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he flipped back to the first page and read the same section again. Monica noticed the change in his posture. What is it? She asked. The lawyer lowered the papers and looked at both of them with a tight expression. These documents reference a legal structure connected to Brandon's estate, he said carefully. Elizabeth frowned. What structure? The lawyer lifted one of the pages again. It appears Brandon established a protected asset trust several months before his death. The words seemed to hang in the air. Elizabeth blinked. That doesn't make sense, she said quickly. We reviewed all of his estate paperwork. The lawyer shook his head slightly. This trust appears to exist outside the basic estate files. Monica leaned forward, suddenly interested. Outside? She asked. Yes, the lawyer replied. He turned another page. The documents indicate that Brandon transferred a significant portion of his financial assets into this trust structure prior to the accident. Monica's expression tightened. What assets? She asked. The lawyer glanced at the list printed on the page. Several investment accounts, long-term savings funds, and portions of property ownerships. Elizabeth straightened in her chair. That's impossible, she said. Her voice was sharper now. The estate documents we prepared include those accounts. The lawyer slowly placed the pages back on the table. If this trust is valid, he said, then those assets would no longer be part of the estate transfer you prepared. For a moment, no one spoke. Monica reached for the documents and quickly scanned the pages herself. Her professional composure began to crack. This can't be right, she muttered. She flipped to the second page, then the third. Her eyes moved faster now. Elizabeth turned toward her. What does it say? She demanded. Monica didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked back at the lawyer. Is this legitimate? She asked. The lawyer studied the documents again. They appear to be formally executed, he said. Signed, witnessed, and legally structured. Elizabeth shook her head. Brandon never mentioned anything like this. The lawyer shrugged slightly. He wouldn't necessarily have needed to. Elizabeth's hands tightened on the edge of the table. This changes nothing, she insisted. We already signed the transfer paperwork. The lawyer looked at her carefully. The paperwork you prepared applies to assets that belong to the estate. He tapped the documents in front of him. If these accounts were placed into a trust before Brandon's death, they are no longer part of that estate. Monica looked up slowly. How much of the estate are we talking about? The lawyer turned another page. His finger moved down a list of account numbers and property references. A significant portion, he said. Elizabeth stared at him. What does that mean? The lawyer answered calmly. It means the transfer agreement you just completed may not apply to most of Brandon's assets. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had happened during the meeting earlier. Elizabeth looked at the documents as if they were written in another language. Monica leaned back in her chair slowly. But that's not possible, she said quietly. I had remained silent the entire time. Now the lawyer turned toward me. Did you know about this? He asked. I nodded once. Brandon left those documents in his workshop, I said. Elizabeth's head snapped toward me. You knew, she demanded. Yes. Her voice rose slightly. And you didn't say anything. I looked at her calmly. You never asked. Monica pushed the documents back toward the lawyer. This has to be a mistake, she said. There are legal procedures for creating trusts like this. The lawyer nodded. There are... He pointed to the bottom of one of the pages. These signatures appear valid. Monica read the page again. Her confidence was disappearing now. Elizabeth turned toward me again. You let us believe we had control of the estate? She said. I didn't deny it. You were very confident, I replied. Her expression hardened. You manipulated the situation. I shook my head. Brandon prepared the situation. The lawyer flipped through the documents again. This trust structure includes strict conditions for asset control, he said. Most of Brandon's investments and accounts are protected inside it. Elizabeth's voice dropped. So what exactly do we control now? The lawyer glanced briefly at the signed paperwork on the table. Only the portion of the estate that was not placed into the trust. Monica stared at the document stack again. What portion is that? The lawyer hesitated slightly before answering. A very small one. Elizabeth's face slowly drained of color. Just 15 minutes earlier, she had been smiling while I signed those papers. Now she sat perfectly still. The victory she had been expecting had vanished in the space of a few pages. The lawyer turned another page and continued reading. And as the meaning of Brandon's documents became clearer with every line, the confidence Elizabeth and Monica had carried into the room disappeared completely. Elizabeth's lawyer continued reading the documents in silence. The room had become so quiet that the faint rustling of paper sounded unusually loud. Every few seconds he paused, scanning another paragraph before moving on. Elizabeth watched him impatiently. "Well?" she said. "What exactly does that document say?" The lawyer placed the pages flat on the table and adjusted his glasses. "It appears Brandon created a protected asset structure several months before the accident," he said. Elizabeth frowned. "You already said that." "Yes," the lawyer replied calmly. "But the details are more extensive than I first thought." Monica leaned forward again, her eyes fixed on the papers. "How extensive?" she asked. The lawyer tapped one of the pages with his finger. "According to this trust agreement, Brandon transferred the majority of his financial assets into a protected legal structure." Elizabeth shook her head. "That doesn't make sense." The lawyer looked up. "It actually makes perfect sense," he said. "This kind of arrangement is often used to protect assets from disputes, unexpected claims, or legal complications." Monica's voice sharpened slightly. "What assets are included?" The lawyer scanned the document again. "Several investment portfolios, retirement accounts, and a portion of the property ownership tied to the house." Elizabeth leaned forward abruptly. "The house?" "Yes," the lawyer said. Monica quickly pulled her laptop closer and began typing. "That house is listed in the estate file," she said. "We reviewed it." The lawyer nodded slowly. "The estate still references the property," he explained. "But this document shows that Brandon adjusted the ownership structure before his death." Monica stopped typing. "What does that mean?" "It means the estate transfer you prepared may only apply to the portion of the property that remained outside the trust." Elizabeth stared at him. "How much of the property is outside it?" The lawyer turned another page. "Based on this document, very little." Elizabeth sat back in her chair. Her earlier confidence had completely vanished. Monica continued reading the trust document carefully. "This must be recent," she said. "It was executed about 6 months ago," the lawyer replied. Monica looked up. 6 months? The lawyer nodded. "It includes formal signatures, witnesses, and registration references." Elizabeth's voice grew tense. "Why would Brandon do that?" The lawyer answered calmly. "Asset protection planning." Monica frowned. "Protection from what?" The lawyer shrugged slightly. "There are many reasons people use trusts. Privacy, tax planning, inheritance control." He paused before adding one more sentence. "And sometimes protection from internal disputes." Elizabeth turned toward me again. "You knew about this," she said quietly. I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, "Brandon left the documents for me." Monica looked up from the papers. "He left them for you?" "Yes." Elizabeth's voice hardened. "So you've known about this the entire time?" "I discovered it after our first meeting," I replied. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "And you said nothing. You seemed very confident about your plan," I said calmly. Monica dropped the document stack back onto the table. "This is unbelievable." She looked toward the lawyer. "Can this trust be challenged?" The lawyer considered the question carefully. "In theory, almost anything can be challenged," he said. "But based on what I'm seeing here, Brandon followed the correct legal procedures." Monica crossed her arms. "So you're saying we can't touch those assets?" "I'm saying it would be very difficult," the lawyer replied. Elizabeth looked back at the documents again. "So what exactly do we control now?" The lawyer gestured toward the signed paperwork sitting beside him. "The estate transfer agreement still applies to any assets Brandon did not place into the trust." Monica immediately asked the next question. "How many assets are those?" The lawyer scanned the list again. "Very few." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. She had spent weeks preparing for this meeting, convincing relatives that she was protecting the family's interests, planning how Brandon's estate would be managed under her authority. And now most of it was suddenly unreachable. Monica leaned back slowly. "So the majority of the investments are locked inside the trust?" "Yes." "And the house is partially protected?" "Yes." Monica looked at me again. "And Brandon designed this before the accident?" "Yes." The room fell quiet once more. Elizabeth stared at the papers as if she were trying to force them to say something different. But the lawyer's explanation had been very clear. The estate transfer she had planned only covered a fraction of Brandon's assets. Everything else had already been secured months earlier. Elizabeth finally spoke again. "You allowed us to move forward with the transfer anyway." "Yes." Her eyes flashed with frustration. "You let us believe we were taking control of the estate." I met her gaze calmly. "You believed that on your own." Monica rubbed her temples slowly. "All those documents, all the planning." The lawyer gathered the trust papers again and placed them neatly in front of him. "Brandon clearly anticipated the possibility of conflict over his estate," he said. Elizabeth said nothing. Monica said nothing. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioner. The meeting that Elizabeth expected to end with her victory had taken a very different turn. And as the lawyer continued reviewing Brandon's trust documents, it became increasingly clear that the plan Elizabeth and Monica had built over the past several weeks had already collapsed. Elizabeth's lawyer placed the documents carefully on the table and took a slow breath before speaking again. "I need to clarify something," he said. His tone had changed. Earlier in the meeting, he sounded confident and procedural, like someone guiding a routine legal transaction. Now his voice carried a cautious weight. Elizabeth leaned forward immediately. "Clarify what?" The lawyer tapped the trust document. "If these documents are valid, and at first glance they appear to be, then the majority of Brandon's financial assets were legally moved out of the estate before his death." Elizabeth stared at him. "That's impossible." "It's not impossible," the lawyer replied calmly. "It's actually quite common in estate planning." Monica folded her arms tightly. "So what exactly is outside the estate now?" The lawyer flipped through the pages again. "Most of the investment accounts, several long-term savings funds, and a portion of the property ownership connected to the house." Elizabeth's expression hardened. "That house belongs to my son." "Yes," the lawyer said. "But according to this document, Brandon transferred part of the property ownership into the trust structure." Monica leaned forward again. "So the house can't be transferred?" The lawyer shook his head slightly. "Not in the way you originally planned." Elizabeth's voice rose. "Then what exactly did we just sign?" The lawyer glanced at the stack of papers beside him. "The documents signed today still apply to the portion of Brandon's estate that remains outside the trust. And that portion is?" Monica asked. The lawyer hesitated for a moment. "Limited." The word landed quietly in the room. Elizabeth's shoulders stiffened. "All of this preparation?" she said slowly. "And you're telling me we get almost nothing?" "I didn't say nothing," the lawyer replied. "But it's significantly less than you expected." Monica leaned back in her chair. "This is unbelievable." Her earlier composure had completely disappeared. She turned toward me. "You knew this would happen." I didn't answer right away. Elizabeth answered for me. Of course she knew. Her voice was cold now. She let us go through the entire process believing we had control. I looked at her calmly. "You were very certain about that." Elizabeth slammed her hand lightly on the table. "You manipulated the situation." "No," I said quietly. "Brandon prepared the situation." The lawyer cleared his throat. "It's important to remain calm here." Elizabeth ignored him. "You pretended to surrender everything. You assumed that—" I replied. Monica rubbed her forehead. "This trust had to be filed somewhere." "It was," the lawyer said. He pointed to a reference number on the page. "The documentation shows it was registered through a private estate planning structure." Monica leaned forward again. "So legally, this holds up." "From what I can see," the lawyer said. "Yes." Elizabeth stared at the papers again as if she could force them to change. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. "He never told me about any trust." The lawyer gave a small shrug. "He didn't have to—" Elizabeth turned toward me once more. "And you're just sitting there like this is normal." I met her eyes. "For me it is." The room fell silent again. Monica slowly closed the laptop in front of her. "All those investment plans," she said quietly. "All those projections? They were gone now. The numbers she had been planning to manage were locked behind the legal structure Brandon had created. Elizabeth looked at the lawyer again. There must be some way to challenge this. The lawyer considered the question carefully. Legally, anyone can challenge almost anything, he said. But based on the signatures, witnesses, and registration dates on these documents, Brandon appears to have executed this trust properly. Monica sighed. So we'd spend years fighting something we might still lose. That's possible, the lawyer said. Elizabeth didn't speak for several seconds. The confident woman who had walked into this meeting expecting to secure her son's entire estate was now staring at a legal wall she hadn't even known existed. Finally, she leaned back slowly in her chair. So this was your plan, she said to me. You let us think we had already won. I didn't deny it. You were very eager to move forward. Elizabeth shook her head slowly. I underestimated you. I thought about Brandon's letter. Just let them believe they're in control until the right moment. You underestimated Brandon, I said. The lawyer gathered the documents again and slid them neatly into a stack. Before anyone takes further legal action, he said, I'll need to review the full trust structure in detail. Elizabeth looked exhausted now. Monica said nothing. The room that had started the morning with quiet confidence now felt heavy with uncertainty. The meeting was effectively over. Elizabeth stood slowly from her chair. She didn't look at me again as she gathered her purse. Monica followed her toward the door. Before leaving, Elizabeth paused briefly beside the table. You may have won this round, she said quietly. I didn't respond. Because this had never been about rounds. It had been about a plan that Brandon had set in motion long before any of us sat down in this room. And the moment Elizabeth believed would mark her victory had instead become the moment everything she built her plan around had collapsed. No one spoke for several seconds after Elizabeth stood up from the table. The lawyer slowly gathered the documents again, placing Brandon's trust papers into a separate folder. The room felt completely different from the moment we had walked in earlier that morning. Elizabeth no longer looked confident. She looked stunned. Monica avoided my eyes entirely as she slid her laptop into her bag. For weeks they had been preparing for this meeting. They had rehearsed every step of the estate transfer, every financial decision, every explanation they would give the rest of the family once Brandon's assets were officially under their control. Now most of those plans had collapsed in a matter of minutes. Elizabeth finally picked up her purse and turned toward the door. Before leaving, she stopped and looked back at the lawyer. You'll review the trust documents, she said. Yes, he replied calmly. And if there's any way to challenge it, you'll tell us. The lawyer nodded. I will review everything carefully. Elizabeth gave a short nod and walked out of the room without saying anything else. Monica followed her, her footsteps quieter than before. The door closed behind them. The silence that followed felt almost peaceful. The lawyer leaned back slightly in his chair. Well, he said after a moment, that was not the outcome they expected. I allowed myself a small breath. No, I said. It wasn't. He looked at the trust papers again. Your husband was very thorough, he said. I nodded slowly. That sounds like Brandon. The lawyer closed the folder and slid it toward me. These documents appear extremely solid. If everything checks out the way it looks right now, Elizabeth will have a very difficult time challenging this structure. I rested my hand lightly on the folder. For the first time since Brandon's death, the tension that had been sitting in my chest for weeks began to loosen. Not because I had won something, but because Brandon's voice, written in that letter, had been right. He had already solved the problem before it even started. I stood up and thanked the lawyer before leaving the office. Outside, the afternoon air felt fresh and clear. The busy street below the office building was full of people moving through their normal routines, completely unaware that an entire family conflict had just unraveled several floors above them. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. For weeks, Elizabeth and Monica had believed they were controlling the situation. They believed my silence meant defeat. They believed Brandon's life could be reduced to a set of documents they could sign their way into owning. But Brandon had known something they didn't. People who move too quickly toward victory often forget to ask one important question. Is the victory actually real? As I drove home, I thought about the last line of the letter Brandon left in the envelope. I trust you to know when the right moment is. He had trusted me, and he had trusted that patience would reveal the truth at exactly the right time. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. The same porch Brandon built one summer weekend. The same windows he insisted on installing himself, even though the instructions said to hire professionals. He used to joke that building something slowly was the only way to make sure it lasted. Inside the house, my daughter was sitting at the kitchen table working on a drawing. She looked up when I walked in. "Did the meeting go okay?" she asked. I smiled softly. "Yes," I said. "It went exactly the way your dad expected." Later that evening, I placed Brandon's letter back inside the envelope and set it in the drawer of the kitchen desk. Not because I needed it anymore, but because it reminded me of something important. Strength doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like waiting quietly while the truth walks into the room on its own. And sometimes the people who believe they are winning are simply walking toward the moment when reality finally catches up with them. If this story made you think about how patience and preparation can change everything, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever seen someone rush toward victory only to realize later that they misunderstood the entire situation? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family conflicts, hidden plans, and unexpected justice like this one, stay here with us and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.